The Battle of the Bulge was not clean, heroic, or cinematic. It was cold, blind, chaotic, and brutal. Tanks froze, engines jammed, crews fought half-blind in snow fog and pine forests where death came from a direction you never saw. Hollywood often turned this battle into spectacle, but a handful of films came dangerously close to the truth. These are the Battle of the Bulge tank films veterans say got closest to reality. Number 15. Battleground, 1949. Battleground earns veteran respect, not because it shows massive armored clashes, but because it understands what tanks meant to infantry trapped in the Ardennes. The film focuses on a paratrooper unit isolated in freezing woods while armor exists as something distant, powerful, and desperately hoped for. Veterans often say this is exactly how it felt. Tanks were not always there. They were rumors, sounds on the horizon, prayers whispered in foxholes. What makes Battleground authentic is its refusal to glorify combat. Men argue, complain, freeze, and slowly break down under exhaustion. The cold is not a backdrop, it is an enemy. Weapons, jam boots, rot, and morale slips inch by inch. When tanks finally appear, they are not heroic saviors charging forward. They are cautious, deliberate, and limited by terrain and weather, just as they were in reality. Veterans praised how the film captures the psychological relationship between infantry and armor. Tanks are lifelines, but also magnets for enemy fire. The movie shows how foot soldiers cling close to them while fearing the artillery that follows. This balance of hope and terror is something many real Bulge veterans recognized instantly. Battleground feels honest because it understands that tank warfare in the Ardennes was never about spectacle. It was about survival minute by minute in the cold. Number 14. A Midnight Clear, 1992. A Midnight Clear is quiet, restrained, and devastatingly accurate in tone. Set during the Battle of the Bulge, it presents tank warfare as something looming and unpredictable rather than constantly visible. Veterans often praised this approach because armored combat in the Ardennes was frequently unseen until it was too late. The film focuses on a small intelligence unit, but the presence of German armor shapes every decision they make. The snow-covered landscape creates confusion where sound travels strangely and visibility vanishes without warning. Tanks do not roar dramatically into frame. They appear suddenly or are heard distantly, forcing soldiers to guess whether to hide, flee, or fight. What veterans recognized most was the fear of misidentification. In the Bulge, tanks often fired at shadows through fog, snow, and trees. The film captures that tension perfectly. Crews and infantry are shown making terrible decisions under pressure not because they are stupid, but because the environment leaves no room for certainty. When armored vehicles finally engage, it is brief, violent, and chaotic. There is no clean choreography, just panic smoke and irreversible consequences. Veterans respected A Midnight Clear because it understood the emotional truth of tank warfare in winter. It shows how machines and men alike become disoriented, fragile, and deadly in the Ardennes. Number 13. The Last Blitzkrieg, 1959. The Last Blitzkrieg is often overlooked, yet veterans have long pointed out its unusual commitment to realism. The film focuses on Operation Greif during the Battle of the Bulge, where German armor and soldiers disguised themselves as Americans to sow confusion behind Allied lines. What sets this film apart is its understanding of armored deception and misdirection. Tank warfare in the Bulge was not always about direct engagement. It was about confusion, fuel shortages, and misused firepower. Veterans appreciated how the film shows German tank crews struggling with logistics, weather, and coordination, rather than portraying them as unstoppable villains. The armored scenes are restrained and tactical. Tanks move cautiously, use cover, and avoid unnecessary exposure. This reflects how crews actually operated in dense forests where one bad decision could mean instant destruction. The film also emphasizes command-level uncertainty. Officers often had incomplete information, and tanks were sent into situations they were never designed for. Veterans respected The Last Blitzkrieg because it acknowledged that the Battle of the Bulge was as much about chaos and mistakes as it was about bravery. Its tanks feel heavy, vulnerable, and limited, exactly how they were in real combat. Number 12. Castle Keep, 1969. Castle Keep is often misunderstood because of its surreal tone, but veterans have long pointed out that beneath the strange presentation lies a brutally honest depiction of late Bulge armored warfare. The film captures the exhaustion, confusion, and fatalism that defined tank crews during the final stages of the Ardennes fighting. Tanks in Castle Keep are not heroic weapons of triumph. They are old, cold machines driven by men who no longer believe in clean victories. The film shows armor positioned defensively, hiding among ruined villages, forests, and snow-covered roads, waiting for an enemy that may or may not come. Veterans recognize this waiting as painfully real. Much of Bulge tank combat involved long periods of immobility where engines froze, fuel ran low, and crews slept inside steel coffins. The film also reflects how commanders often had little strategic clarity. Tanks were ordered to hold absurd positions or defend symbolic locations with no tactical value. Veterans saw this not as satire, but as truth. The Battle of the Bulge was filled with desperate orders and last stands driven more by morale than logic. Castle Keep respects the reality that tank warfare in the Ardennes felt disconnected from grand strategy. It was muddy, pointless, terrifying, and often surreal. That emotional truth is why veterans still quietly defend this film. Number 11. Saints and Soldiers, 2003. Saints and Soldiers earns veteran respect because it understands how tanks and infantry depended on each other during the Battle of the Bulge. The film avoids flashy armored charges and instead focuses on coordination, survival, and hesitation. Tanks are shown as powerful but blind without infantry support, and infantry are helpless without armor nearby. Veterans frequently praised how the film portrays communication breakdowns. Radios fail, orders conflict, and tank crews are forced to make split-second decisions without knowing what lies beyond the tree line. This mirrors real Bulge combat, where snow fog and terrain turned every engagement into guesswork. When tanks appear, they are used cautiously. They anchor positions, cover withdrawals, and intimidate rather than dominate. The film shows how crews feared close-range ambushes from hidden German anti-tank weapons. Tanks frequently reposition and rely on foot soldiers to scout ahead. This slow, methodical movement is something veterans recognized immediately as authentic. Saints and Soldiers also captures the psychological bond between tankers and infantry. Men shelter behind armor while tank crews depend on infantry to keep enemy soldiers from crawling close with explosives. That mutual dependence defines real Ardennes combat, and the film treats it with respect and restraint. Number 10. Everyman's War, 2009. Every Man's War stands out because it is rooted in a real veteran's experience during the Battle of the Bulge. The film does not exaggerate tank battles, but places armor exactly where veterans say it belonged, as limited support stretched thin across impossible defensive lines. The tanks in this film are shown as precious assets, not disposable weapons. Commanders hesitate before committing them, knowing replacements are scarce and fuel is limited. Veterans consistently praise this portrayal because Bulge tank warfare was defined by scarcity. Crews often fought knowing there would be no backup if things went wrong. The film shows tanks providing overwatch fire rather than charging headlong into combat. They defend crossroads, protect retreats, and fire through narrow forest gaps where visibility is measured in feet. This defensive, cautious use of armor is far closer to reality than most Hollywood portrayals. Every Man's War also highlights the emotional toll on tank crews. The fear of mechanical failure, freezing temperatures, and unseen enemy fire weighs heavily on every decision. Veterans recognize this quiet dread as one of the most truthful elements of the film. It understands that the Battle of the Bulge was not about glory. It was about holding the line until something broke. Number 9. Battle of the Bulge, 1965. Battle of the Bulge is often criticized by historians, yet many armored veterans still defend parts of it for reasons Hollywood critics miss. While the film takes liberties with geography and equipment, it captures something emotionally accurate about large-scale armored warfare in winter. Veterans recognize the feeling of massed steel pushing through snow fog and confusion, with commanders struggling to control events once fighting began. The film shows tanks operating in brutal weather conditions where engines, strain crews freeze, and visibility collapses without warning. That sense of machines fighting the environment as much as the enemy is something Bulge tankers frequently described. Veterans also noted how the movie depicts armor becoming bogged down, not just physically but strategically, as plans collapse under real-world pressure. What resonates most is how tank crews are portrayed as tense, exhausted, and isolated inside their vehicles. Communication breaks down, orders arrive late, and battlefield awareness shrinks to whatever lies directly ahead of the gun barrel. While the tanks themselves may not always be historically perfect, the mindset feels real. Veterans often say, "Battle of the Bulge gets the emotional chaos right even when the details stumble." It shows armored warfare as loud, confusing, exhausting, and frightening rather than heroic pageantry. That truth is why it still earns reluctant respect. Number 8. Patton, 1970. Patton is not a Battle of the Bulge tank film in the narrow sense, but veterans insist it belongs on this list for one reason. It captures how armored warfare was actually commanded. The Bulge was won not just by tanks in combat, but by rapid movement logistics and ruthless decision-making under impossible conditions. The film shows Patton treating tanks as tools that must be preserved, maneuvered, and unleashed at the right moment. Veterans praised how armor is shown moving long distances under pressure, often racing against weather, fuel shortages, and exhaustion. This operational realism reflects what actually broke the German advance. Tank crews in Patton are not glorified individually. They are part of a massive machine responding to orders sometimes without understanding the bigger picture. Veterans recognize this dynamic instantly. Many tankers fought without ever knowing why their unit was redeployed or what larger battle they were influencing. Patton respects the reality that armored warfare during the Bulge was about speed, discipline, and endurance. Tanks were not dueling knights. They were blunt instruments driven hard until something gave. The film understands that truth and presents it with rare confidence. Number 7. The Big Red One, 1980. The Big Red One earns veteran praise because it understands how tanks felt to infantry during the Battle of the Bulge. They were both saviors and dangers. The film portrays armor as something powerful but distant, often appearing briefly before moving on, leaving foot soldiers exposed once again. Veterans appreciated how the film avoids romanticizing armored combat. Tanks move cautiously, pause often, and rely on infantry to survive. When they engage the enemy, it is fast, violent, and usually confusing rather than triumphant. This reflects how real Bulge engagements unfolded in forests, villages, and frozen roads. The film also captures the emotional disconnect between tank crews and infantry. They depend on each other but live very different wars. Tankers fight inside steel shells while infantry face the elements directly. Veterans recognized this separation and respected the film for acknowledging it without judgment. The Big Red One feels authentic because it treats tanks as part of a larger grinding system rather than the focus of spectacle. It understands that the Battle of the Bulge was not won by heroic charges, but by endurance, coordination, and sheer refusal to collapse. Number 6. Saints and Soldiers: The Void, 2014. Saints and Soldiers. The Void moves closer to armored combat than its predecessor, and veterans noticed immediately. The film places tanks in situations that feel desperate, constrained, and tactically limited, which mirrors how armor actually fought during the Battle of the Bulge. Tanks are not free to maneuver. They are boxed in by forests, snow-narrow roads, and constant threat from hidden anti-tank weapons. Veterans often point out how the film shows tanks advancing slowly with infantry clearing ground ahead of them. This is critical realism. In the Ardennes, armor without infantry was vulnerable and frequently destroyed. The Void respects this by showing tank crews hesitant, careful, and visibly tense every time they move forward. The film also highlights mechanical fragility. Tanks stall, struggle to turn, and become liabilities when immobilized. Veterans praise this because winter warfare punished machines as much as men. Frozen fuel lines, dead batteries, and jammed turrets were constant threats rarely shown in movies. Saints and Soldiers. The Void earns respect because it treats tanks as valuable, fragile assets rather than invincible monsters. It shows armored warfare as a grinding, nerve-wracking process where survival depends on teamwork, patience, and luck. That understanding places it closer to the truth than many bigger budget films. Number 5. The Ashes of Katyn, 2007. For nearly 70 years, the truth of the Katyn massacre was buried under lies. In 1940, the Soviet NKVD executed over 20,000 Polish military officers, intellectuals, and prisoners of war, yet the USSR blamed Nazi Germany, and post-war Poland, under Soviet control, was forced to uphold the fiction. To question it was dangerous. Silence was enforced by censorship, fear, and state power. In 2007, Polish director Andrzej Wajda, whose own father was among the victims, released Katyn, a harrowing cinematic reckoning. The film spares no detail. Arrests are methodical, executions clinical. Men are processed like inventory, stripped of coats, bound, and shot in the back of the head. The horror lies not in chaos, but in bureaucratic precision. The response was fierce. Russian officials denounced it. Eastern European broadcasters restricted it. Even in Poland, it stirred painful memories many had tried to forget. But Wajda wasn't making history, he was restoring it. Every frame served as testimony, drawn from exhumed evidence and survivor accounts. For him, Katyn wasn't art, it was duty. In a world that had long denied the truth, the film became both memorial and moral verdict, proving that some stories must be told, no matter how long it takes. Number 4, Band of Brothers, 2001. Band of Brothers is not a tank film, yet its Battle of the Bulge episodes earn high praise from veterans, including tankers. The series understands how armor shaped infantry experience even when tanks were rarely seen. Their absence, presence, and delayed arrival define the tension of the Bulge. When tanks do appear, they are not glorified. They arrive cautiously, often too late, and immediately draw enemy fire. Veterans appreciated how armor is shown coordinating carefully with infantry rather than charging blindly forward. This reflects how combined arms actually functioned in the Ardennes. The series also captures the emotional relief tanks brought to frozen infantry. The sound of engines and the sight of armor moving through snow meant survival. Veterans consistently mention this reaction, and Band of Brothers depicts it with restraint and authenticity. What makes the portrayal credible is its respect for limitations. Tanks do not solve every problem. Weather, fuel shortages, and command confusion still dominate events. Band of Brothers earns its place because it understands the reality of Bulge warfare even when tanks remain just off-screen. Number 3, Fury, 2014. Fury is not set directly during the Battle of the Bulge, yet many armored veterans insist it captures the closest psychological truth of late-war tank combat in winter Europe. What the film gets right is not geography but mindset. Crews are exhausted, fatalistic, and painfully aware that every engagement could be their last. The tank is portrayed as both home and coffin. Veterans repeatedly describe this dual reality, and Fury leans into it without hesitation. The cramped interior, the constant noise, the smell of oil, sweat, and fear all feel authentic. Tankers recognize the way crews develop rituals, arguments, and dark humor to survive mentally inside steel walls. Combat in Fury is messy, brutal, and terrifyingly fast. Tanks do not dance or duel cleanly. Shots miss ricochet or kill instantly with no warning. Veterans praised how the film shows how quickly control disappears once fighting begins. Visibility collapses, panic spreads, and decisions are made on instinct rather than doctrine. For Bulge veterans, Fury feels emotionally accurate even if the setting differs. It understands what it meant to fight winter-armored battles where survival depended on crew cohesion, luck, and nerve more than heroism. Number 2, Attack, 1956. Attack is rarely mentioned in Battle of the Bulge lists, yet veterans consistently cite it as one of the most truthful depictions of ground combat involving armor support. Though not exclusively a tank film, it shows how infantry experienced armor during desperate winter fighting. Tanks in Attack are distant, unreliable, and frighteningly powerful. They appear briefly, offer limited support, and then move on, leaving infantry to deal with the consequences. Veterans often said this was reality. Tanks were not personal guardians. They were mission-driven assets that could not always stay. The film also captures command failure honestly. Poor leadership, miscommunication, and reckless orders lead to unnecessary deaths. Veterans recognized this painful truth immediately. Tank deployments during the Bulge were often dictated by flawed intelligence and political pressure rather than battlefield logic. Attack earns its high placement because it understands how armor fit into the wider human cost of war. Tanks were tools used by fallible men, and sometimes their presence changed nothing. That bleak honesty resonated deeply with veterans who lived through the Bulge. Number 1, the Battle of Algiers, 1966. Gillo Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers is less a film than a forensic reconstruction of urban warfare. Depicting the 1954-1962 Algerian War of Independence with chilling realism, it uses non-professional actors, handheld cameras, and actual locations to create the immediacy of a newsreel. Bombings, torture, executions, and reprisals unfold without narration, music, or moral judgment. Only stark, black-and-white clarity. That very neutrality made it dangerous. France banned the film for nearly a decade, fearing not its bias, but its accuracy. Veterans groups rioted, politicians denounced it as subversive. Yet the film refuses easy allegiances. It shows FLN militants planting bombs in cafes, killing civilians, and French paratroopers torturing suspects as routine procedure. No side emerges heroic, only trapped within a system where violence begets violence. Ironically, its banned status only amplified its reach. It circulated underground, then became required study in military and intelligence academies worldwide, including by the very forces it critiqued. The Battle of Algiers endures not as propaganda, but as a mirror, revealing how modern counterinsurgency blurs lines between soldier and civilian, justice and terror. Once seen, its vision of war's moral erosion cannot be unseen, making it one of cinema's most potent and perilous truths. The Battle of the Bulge was not won by cinematic charges or perfect machines. It was won by frozen crews, exhausted infantry, and tanks pushed beyond their limits. These films come closest because they respect that truth. If you want the next list covering tank films, veterans say got it wrong, just say the word.